The life of Queen Helen of Romania was a study in loss. She was a princess exiled by politics. She was a wife publicly and cruelly betrayed by her notorious playboy husband, King Carol II, who abandoned her to run off with his mistress. She was a mother who, in the darkest days of World War II, fought a fascist dictator to save thousands of lives, earning her the title Queen of Mercy. And what was the reward for this lifetime of dignity? Her reward came in the first cold hours of 1948. A sealed train, racing away from a now communist Romania on board, Helen, 51, and her son, the last king, were being searched by soldiers like common criminals. They had been forced to abdicate at gunpoint. This was not an abdication, it was an expulsion. And for the woman who had endured it all, this was her third and final exile. How could this woman withstand her husband's betrayal and history's brutality with such calm? The answer is that she was forged to do it. Before she was the Queen Mother of Romania, she was first the Princess of Greece. You must go back to her first exile. Helen was born in 1896, a princess of Greece and Denmark. She was a royal's royal, a great-granddaughter of Queen Victoria, connected to the thrones of Britain, Russia, and Germany. But her royal life in Greece was nothing like it was in Britain. It was not stable. It was a new fragile monarchy, and her childhood was defined by a single toxic political storm, the National Schism. It was a bitter spiritual civil war between her pro-German father, King Constantine, and his charismatic, fiercely pro-Allied prime minister. The country was split in two. For the teenage Helen, life was not debutante balls. It was living in a palace under siege. In 1917, this feud exploded. The Allies, having lost their patience, began to shell their home. Helen, 21 years old, had to hide in the wine cellar with her family as Allied artillery rounds landed in her garden. And then the Allies did the unthinkable. They deposed her father. In an instant, her fairy tale life vanished. She was no longer a princess. She was a refugee, forced to flee to Switzerland, penniless and humiliated. And this is the psychological key. While her family despaired, Helen became their rock, their loyal Antigone. At 21, she learned the core, bitter lesson of her life. Everything can be taken away. She learned that political passions are a fire, and the only dignified response is not to fight back, but to endure, to be quiet, to be stoic, and to turn her dignity into a suit of armor. She became a Spartan, trained for a life of quiet suffering, never knowing this strength would soon be seen as a fatal weakness in the most chaotic and brutal court in Europe. After 3 years in gray Swiss exile, the wheel of fortune turned. In 1920, Helen's father was recalled to the Greek throne. Helen, now 24, returned to Athens as a heroine and was suddenly Europe's most eligible princess. A suitor quickly emerged from Romania, Crown Prince Carol. If Helen was a symbol of quiet endurance, Carol was the embodiment of charismatic chaos. He was a notorious Byronic bad boy, the heir every royal family dreaded, infamous for deserting the army to marry a commoner. He was the most dangerous man in Europe, and he needed a proper royal bride to stabilize his reputation and secure the succession. When Carol arrived in Athens, the connection was a coup de foudre. He, bored by society flirts, was mesmerized by her Hellenic beauty and deep, soulful eyes. She, who had only known the gray boredom of exile, nursing a failed father, was intoxicated by his tornado of charm and power. It was a whirlwind romance, and they married in a glittering Athens ceremony in March 1921. For Helen, it was the ultimate vindication, a love match that made her the future queen of a great nation. It was the perfect happy ending, or rather it was the end of the fairy tale. and the beginning of the nightmare. The first year in Bucharest was golden. Helen was popular, and most importantly, on October 25, 1921, she gave birth to a healthy son, Michael. She had fulfilled her one primary duty. The dynasty was secure. Michael became the single, absolute focus of her existence. And it was a good thing, too, because as soon as the heir was born, the charming, adoring prince vanished, and the real Carol emerged. The marble statue he had married, with her Spartan virtues and moral rigidity, was now boring. Carol was a man of storms and passion, and he went back to his old life of parties and, most importantly, other women. Helen, a new mother in a foreign snake pit court, was left tragically isolated. She, who had been trained to endure but not to scheme, was completely out of her depth. She was a stranger in her new home with a husband who was publicly humiliating her. And then in 1923, Carol met the woman who would not just be another affair, but who would destroy Helen's life completely and irrevocably: Magda Lupescu. Magda was everything Helen was not: fiery, red-headed, cynical, politically savvy, and unbound by moral codes. She was his mirror image, his dark soulmate, and Carol, an addict of chaos, became addicted. This was not a secret. It was a public explosion. He paraded his mistress, abandoning all pretense of propriety. He had, in effect, publicly told his wife, his family, and his country, "This is my real queen for Helen." This was the ultimate unbearable humiliation. This was not just adultery. It was an abdication of his role as husband and crown prince. The royal family was apoplectic. The situation became so toxic and politically dangerous that in 1925 the final crisis exploded. The crisis of 1925 was not a private disagreement. It was a constitutional war, and it was fought inside the palace. King Ferdinand, himself a dying man, and the formidable Queen Marie were apoplectic. This affair with Magda Lupescu was not just an embarrassment, it was a political liability. Lupescu, being Jewish, was a target for the vicious rising anti-Semitic forces in the country, like the Iron Guard Carol. By parading her, was not just being a bad husband, he was destabilizing the entire nation. He was given a brutal ultimatum by his father: give up Magda Lupescu, or give up the throne. Helen, caught in the crossfire, was now a pawn in their game. Her entire life, her future as queen, her son's future, all depended on the whim of a man she no longer recognized. She was once again in that familiar, agonizing position of her childhood, waiting for a man, first her father, now her husband, to decide her fate. In November 1925, Carol was sent on a cooling-off mission. He was ordered to represent the Romanian royal family at the funeral of Britain's Queen Alexandra. It was, the family hoped, a way to get him away from Lupescu's influence, to remind him of his royal duties, of his connection to the respectable monarchies of Europe. It was a fatal miscalculation. They had not sent him on a mission. They had given him an escape route. From London, Carol did not return to Bucharest. He traveled to Paris, and there, reunited with Magda Lupescu, he made his choice. He did not choose his crown. He did not choose his country. He did not choose his mother. He did not choose his wife. And he did not choose his 4-year-old son, Michael. He chose Magda. In December 1925, he sent a letter back to Bucharest. It was a formal, cold, and irreversible document. He was, for the second time in his life, renouncing his right to the throne of Romania. He was abdicating his role as crown prince, as a general, as a husband, and as a father. He wanted to be a private citizen, Mr. Carol Careyman, free to live in decadent bohemian exile with the woman he loved. You must for a moment put yourself inside Helen's mind. The news, when it was delivered to her at Cotrocini Palace, was not a simple political fact. It was a psychological detonation. What did she feel? Relief that the monster was finally gone? Anger at this final public humiliation? No, based on everything we know, what she likely felt was a cold, grim, and profound sense of vindication. Her Spartan training, her Antigone complex, had kicked in. She had been the good wife. She had been loyal. She had been dutiful. She had produced the heir. He, in contrast, had proven himself to be exactly what she suspected, a weak, degenerate, and dishonorable man. The world could now see what she saw. He had not just left her, he had martyred her. Overnight, her public identity was transformed. She was no longer the boring foreign princess. She was Saint Helen, the martyr wife, the Regina Mama in spirit, if not yet in name. The Romanian people who had been suspicious of her quietness now embraced her. Her suffering, her dignity, her stoic silence in the face of this colossal public betrayal made her a heroine. She was everything Carol was not. She was loyal, she was pious, and, most importantly, she stayed for King Ferdinand. This was the last straw. Furious and dying of cancer, he acted decisively. On January 4th, 1926, he accepted his son's abdication. He had Carol formally stripped of his titles, his rights, and his inheritance. He had him banished, forbidden from ever returning to Romania, and then he changed the line of succession. The new heir to the throne of Romania was not Carol. It was the 4-year-old boy Helen had clung to her son, Michael. Helen's life in that instant was completely inverted. She had lost a husband, but she had gained a kingdom. Her rival, Magda Lupescu, was a disgraced exile in Paris. Her husband, Carol, was a pariah living in a hotel, and she was now the most important woman in Romania. She was the mother of the future king. This was her fortress. This was the world she now began to build. For the next year, as King Ferdinand's health failed, Helen poured all of her thwarted energy, her intelligence, and her fierce protective love into one single vessel, her son. She was not just raising a boy, she was forging a king, and she was, in her mind, forging the anti-Carol. Where Carol was loud, Michael would be quiet. Where Carol was impulsive, Michael would be dutiful. Where Carol was arrogant, Michael would be pious. Where Carol was selfish, Michael would be selfless. She was, in essence, trying to raise a Spartan king. She was raising her son to be her, not him. In July 1927, King Ferdinand died. The moment he passed, Helen's world solidified. The 5-year-old Michael, dressed in a miniature admiral's uniform, was proclaimed King Michael I of Romania. He was, of course, too young to rule. A 3-man regency was appointed to govern in his name, led by his uncle, Prince Nicholas. But the regency was a political committee. The moral power, the symbolic heart of the entire nation, now rested with the 29-year-old woman who held the boy king's hand. Helen was officially given the title she had been living, Regina Mama, the Queen Mother. The period from 1927 to 1930 was, in a strange, quiet way, Helen's golden age. It was the only time in her life when she was truly, completely happy. Her world was perfect. She lived at Cotrocini Palace, which was now her court. She was revered by the nation as a symbol of motherhood and sacrifice, and she was in absolute, total control of the one thing that mattered, her son. Her life became a monastic, devoted routine. Her days were structured not around politics, but around Michael's education. She supervised his tutors. She read to him. She prayed with him. She instilled in him her own profound, quiet, orthodox faith. She taught him above all else the one lesson she had learned from her own father, the sacred, unbreakable bond of duty. They were, by all accounts, incredibly close. They were not just mother and son. They were a fortress of two, a small, quiet, moral island in the center of the chaotic, corrupt, and noisy world of Bucharest politics. But the Byzantine court had not gone away. It was just regrouping. While Helen was building her perfect moral world with Michael, the real world was intruding. The Great Depression hit, and Romania's economy, dependent on agricultural exports, was collapsing. The politicians in the regency were seen as weak and corrupt. The people were suffering. And in times of chaos, people do not look for moral leaders. They look for strong ones. A new, dangerous faction began to emerge. They were the Carolists. They were politicians, army officers, and industrialists who had benefited from Carol's corrupt, charismatic style. They missed the glamour. They missed the energy. And they began to whisper a powerful, seductive idea. This regency is a disaster. This boy king is a farce. We need a real king. We need the strong man. We need to bring Carol back. This movement began as a whisper, a series of secret meetings in smoky Bucharest cafes. They sent feelers to Carol in his Parisian exile, and he naturally was more than receptive. He was bored. The money was running out. And his ego, his colossal, restless ego, was hungry. He wanted his crown back. But there was one massive obstacle. The most popular person in the country, Helen. The people would never accept Carol, the betrayer, unless he made peace with Helen, the saint. And so the plotting began. A message was sent to Helen, a proposal cloaked in the language of patriotism. The nation is suffering. The politicians are failing. Carol is remorseful. He has learned his lesson. He is willing to come back to restore stability, but he will only do it if he can reconcile with his good, beloved wife. He would come back, resume his place as king, and she would be his queen. And here is the most crucial and most debated part of Helen's story. Here is where her Spartan virtue, her passivity, became a political liability. She was not a schemer. She was a reactor. She was an endurer. She was surrounded by a cabinet, by her brother-in-law, Prince Nicholas, all of whom were now being pressured, bribed, or intimidated by the Carolists. They came to her and said, "This is the only way, for the good of the nation, for the good of your son. You must agree to this reconciliation." She was, in her heart, a pragmatist. She was terrified of the alternative, a fascist coup by the Iron Guard, or a complete societal collapse. And perhaps there was one tiny, deeply buried part of her, the 24-year-old girl who had fallen in love in Athens, that wanted to believe the fairy tale could be put back together, that the man who had charmed her could be charmed again. In 1930, after months of agonizing secret negotiations, she gave her answer. She agreed. In her passive, dutiful way, had just signed her own death warrant. She thought she was agreeing to a national reconciliation. She had no idea she was, in fact, authorizing her own destruction. She had no idea that her husband and the politicians were lying. They had no intention of a real reconciliation. They just needed her name to authorize the coup. In early June 1930, the operetta was staged. The Prime Minister, Iuliu Maniu, who had publicly sworn to oppose Carol, secretly gave the green light. Carol, who was in Paris, shaved off his famous mustache. He borrowed a false passport. He climbed into a plane. He landed on a small airfield outside Bucharest on June 6, 1930. It was a dramatic, swashbuckling, middle-of-the-night return. The army, which had been prearranged, immediately declared its loyalty. Helen woke up at Cotrocini Palace on the morning of June 7th to discover a new, terrifying reality. Her ex-husband was back. The politicians, in a frantic 24-hour session, tore up the Constitution. They deposed their own king, and on June 8th, her 8-year-old son Michael was no longer His Majesty, the king. He was demoted humiliatingly to Grand Voivode, or Crown Prince. And the man who had abandoned his family, the man who had renounced his throne twice, the man who was still, in the eyes of the law, a disgraced private citizen, was now, by an act of Parliament, His Majesty King Carol II of Romania. And this is the moment of Helen's supreme personal and public humiliation. It is one of the most chilling personal stories in royal history. Carol, now king, summoned her. He was not the remorseful husband. He was the conqueror. He was in his element, the drama, the power, the applause, and he came to her with his promise. We will be reconciled. We will be king and queen in Helen. Her entire world collapsing, her son just stripped of his crown, was forced to play her part in the charade. She was forced to stand on the palace balcony next to the man she now knew she despised, the man who had broken her heart and just stolen her son's throne. And she was forced, in front of the cheering, confused, ecstatic crowds, to smile. She had to smile and pretend that her betrayer had come home, that the royal family was whole again. It was the most grotesque and most public lie of her life. She played her part. She agreed to be his queen, and she waited. She waited for him to fulfill his one crucial, non-negotiable promise, the promise that he had made to her, to the politicians, and to the nation, that he had given up Magda Lupescu for good. She waited. She had no idea that he had been lying. He had lied to his country. He had lied to his government. And he had lied to his wife. Within weeks of his triumphant return, Magda Lupescu was smuggled into Romania. The play was over, and the true psychological torture was just about to begin. Helen had been forced to stand on the palace balcony, to smile, to play her part in the great lie of her husband's remorseful return. She, the quiet Spartan, had done her duty. She had agreed to this grotesque public charade for the good of the nation and for the stability of her son's future. And she had done it based on one single, non-negotiable condition, that the other woman, Magda Lupescu, was gone forever. It was a promise that King Carol II had made to his government, to his people, and to his wife. And he had been lying within weeks, some say even days, of his triumphant return. Magda Lupescu was smuggled back into Romania. She did not arrive with fanfare. She slipped in quietly, like a poison being introduced to the water supply. This was not a reconciliation. It was a hostage negotiation, and Helen had just discovered the terms were a fraud. Carol, now all-powerful, did not even bother to hide the deception for long. He was king. He was, in his mind, an absolute monarch, and he would no longer be told what to do. He established his mistress not in some discreet apartment, but in a lavish, opulent villa in the heart of Bucharest. And this villa, not the Cotrocini Palace where Helen lived, and not the royal palace where he worked, became the real center of power in Romania. You must understand who Magda Lupescu was. She was not a simple, grasping mistress. She was, in her own way, a political genius. She was Carol's partner, his shadow, his brain. Where he was all restless ego and chaotic energy, she was the cold, calculating strategist. She understood his weaknesses, she pandered to his vanities, and she, more than anyone, knew how to use his power together. They formed what history now calls the Royal Camarilla. It was a shadow government, a kitchen cabinet of corrupt industrialists, fawning courtiers, and secret police chiefs, all of whom met not with the king, but with Madame Lupescu. If you wanted a government contract, if you wanted a military promotion, if you wanted a law passed or a rival crushed, you did not go to the parliament. You went to Lupescu's villa, and you brought a very, very large gift. Carol and Magda were not just ruling Romania, they were plundering it, and they were having the time of their lives. Bucharest in the 1930s became a whirl of jazz, fast cars, and decadent parties, all centered around the king and his red-headed mistress. And Helen? Where was Helen in all this? She was a prisoner. She was the official queen, but she was a prop. She was trapped in the Cotrocini Palace, a living, breathing public humiliation. She was the marble statue of dignity that Carol kept on display to appease the old world conservatives, while he, the fire, lived his real life across town. She was forced to endure the whispers, the pitying looks, the newspaper articles that spoke in code about the power behind the throne. She, who had been trained to value dignity and honor above all else, was now the official, state-sanctioned fool. But the humiliation was not enough for Carol. Her very presence, her quiet, Spartan, moral presence, was a silent judgment. Her dignity was a mirror to his own degeneracy, and he hated her for it. He could not just ignore her. He had to break her. He wanted a divorce. He needed to be free of this cold, boring woman so he could, one day perhaps, marry Lupescu and make her the real queen. But Helen, in her one final desperate act of Spartan defiance, refused. She would not be set aside. She was the mother of the heir. She was the anointed queen. She had done her duty. She would not participate in her own destruction. She would not give him the satisfaction. Her quiet, passive endurance now became a powerful, active resistance. Her answer was no. And that is when the real psychological torture began. Carol was an absolute monarch. He could not force her to sign a paper, but he could make her life so unbearable that she would beg for it. And he knew with the chilling precision of a true sadist her one single vulnerable point. He knew what she loved. He knew the one thing in the world she could not live without her son, Michael. Carol now began a systematic, cold-blooded campaign to weaponize the 9-year-old boy and to psychologically destroy the bond between mother and son. His first act was physical. He declared that the Grand Voivode Michael, the heir to the throne, could no longer live at Cotrocini Palace with his mother. He was to move into the royal palace in Bucharest under his roof. Helen was frantic. This was a state decision, he explained. For the boy's education as a future king, she was powerless to stop it. His second act was to restrict her access. She, the boy's mother, the woman who had not spent a single day apart from him, was now informed that she could only see her son on a schedule. Then the true Byzantine cruelty began. Carol began a campaign of re-education. He surrounded the young, impressionable Michael with a new set of tutors and military aides. These were not the men Helen had chosen. These were Carol's men, members of the Camarilla, all of them loyal only to the king and to Madame Lupescu. And their job was not just to teach the boy mathematics. Their job was to poison his mind. You have to imagine this. A 9-year-old boy, lonely, confused, and separated from his mother. And every day his father, the king, the most powerful man he knows, is telling him things. Your mother is difficult. Your mother is unwell. Your mother doesn't really love us. She's cold. When Helen was allowed her scheduled supervised visits, the atmosphere was toxic. One of Carol's aides was always present, listening, taking notes. Michael, a sensitive, quiet boy, was terrified. He was trapped between the two warring forces of his life. He adored his mother, but he was terrified of his father. Helen, watching her son become quiet, nervous, and distant, was in a state of constant silent panic. She was watching her son be psychologically stolen from her day by day, and she could do nothing. She was the queen mother, and she had no power at all. This went on for over a year, a grinding daily war of attrition. Carol, the master of chaos, was strangling her with 1,000 tiny bureaucratic cuts. He was proving to her every single day that she had nothing. The final, most humiliating blow came in 1931. Carol, enraged by her continued stubborn refusal to grant the divorce, played his last card. He used his power as absolute monarch to pass a new law, a decree that stripped Helen of her royal titles and her state funding. He banned the press from ever calling her queen. He had her name removed from the royal liturgy in the churches. She was to be styled simply Her Majesty Helen. He was, piece by piece, an act at a time, erasing her from public life. And in 1932, after nearly 2 years of this relentless psychological warfare, she finally, totally broke. She had lost. He had won. He had proven to her that he was willing to destroy their son's mind just to win a legal argument. And she, in a final act of maternal sacrifice, realized the only way to save Michael from this unbearable position was to remove herself from the equation. She gave in. She agreed to the divorce, and Carol, having finally gotten what he wanted, delivered his last most venomous act of vengeance. He did not just divorce her. He did not just send her away. He banished her. He had the government, his government, declare her an enemy of the state. She was to be exiled, forbidden from ever setting foot in Romania again. She was 5,000 miles from the 21-year-old girl who had been exiled from Greece that was a political exile. This was a personal one. This was a spiteful, cruel act of a triumphant, abusive husband. She was told she could live anywhere in the world except her own country. And in a final chilling concession, he, the king, would allow her to see her son, the son she had raised, the son who was her entire life, for just 4 weeks, twice a year. Think about that. This woman, whose entire identity was mother, was now being paid a ransom of 8 weeks a year just to see her child. In 1932, Helen, the Queen Mother, walked out of Cotrocini Palace for the last time. She was 36 years old. She was a divorcee, a pariah, and an exile. She boarded a train, her head held high in public, her face a mask of Spartan control. But her heart and her life had been completely and finally shattered. She settled in Florence, Italy. It was a city she loved. And there, in the hills outside the city, she bought a villa. She named it Villa Sparta. The name was her last private defiance statement. She was once again the Spartan in exile. For the next 8 years, from 1932 to 1940, Helen lived the life of a ghost. She was the queen in exile, a forgotten, tragic figure. She did what she had always done in times of crisis. She endured. She created a small, perfect, quiet world. She poured her grief into her garden, which became one of the most beautiful in all of Florence. She read, she painted, she surrounded herself with her books and her art. She was, in her own way, living the life of a nun, a queen abbess in her own private convent. Her world was quiet, it was orderly, and it was safe, and twice a year, that world would be briefly, joyfully, and painfully illuminated. The Mihai visits, as they were known, were the center of her year. Her son, now a growing teenager, would be flown in from Bucharest, always accompanied by one of his father's aides, who was there to listen, to watch, to report back. For those few precious weeks, Helen would try, desperately, to be a mother. They would talk, they would play tennis, they would work in the garden. She would try, in that short time, to undo the months of poison her son had been fed in Bucharest. She would try to remind him of who he was, of his duty, of his faith. And Michael, a quiet, serious boy, just as lonely as she was, clung to these visits. Villa Sparta was not just a vacation. It was his sanctuary. It was the only place in the world where he was not a political pawn. It was the only place he felt safe. It was the only place he felt simply loved. And then the 4 weeks would be up, and she would have to stand at her door and watch with that same terrible Spartan control as her son was driven away, back to his father, back to the snake pit. This was her life, a life of gardening, of reading, and of waiting. Meanwhile, back in Bucharest, her ex-husband, King Carol II, was having the time of his life. He was at the absolute, dizzying peak of his power. With Helen gone, his moral mirror was removed. He and Magda Lupescu were in total control. He tore up the last vestiges of Romania's democracy and declared a royal dictatorship. He was now the conductor, the leader, second only to his new friends, Hitler and Mussolini. He created a bizarre fascist-light cult of personality with a youth movement, massive parades, and a new, fantastically corrupt constitution. He was, in his own mind, a Caesar. He had everything. He had his mistress. He had absolute power. He had his son, who he was molding into his own corrupt image, and his boring, pious Spartan wife was gone, a forgotten ghost in Italy. He had won, completely. Helen, in her garden in Florence, simply waited. She was an expert in the art of waiting. She had seen this all before. She had seen it with her father's enemies. She knew that men like Carol, men of such colossal arrogance, men who flew so high and so fast, always made one fatal mistake. They believed their own lies. They believed they were invincible. She knew that he was not a Caesar. He was a man in a fantasy, driving his country and himself straight towards a cliff. And in 1940, as the shadow of the Second World War finally fell over Europe, he reached the edge. King Carol II of Romania was a Caesar. He was a royal dictator, an ally of Hitler, and the absolute master of a nation being plundered by him and his mistress, Magda Lupescu. He had won. He had defeated every enemy. Helen, his ex-wife, was a forgotten ghost planting flowers in Italy. His son, Michael, was a shy, controlled teenage prince, a pawn in his game. And then in one short year, the world that Carol had built, the world he had traded his family and his honor to get, collapsed completely. The fire that consumed him did not come from within Romania, but from without it came from the two men he had tried so desperately to emulate and appease, Adolf Hitler and Joseph Stalin. In August 1939, Hitler and Stalin signed a pact, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. It was a shocking agreement, one where the two mortal enemies secretly agreed to carve up Eastern Europe. And Romania, rich and plump, was on their map. In June 1940, Stalin made his move. He sent an ultimatum to King Carol II. He didn't ask to negotiate. He demanded the province of Bessarabia. Carol, the strong man, the Caesar, was thrown into a total panic. He looked to his ally Hitler for help. And Hitler, cold as ice, told him to take the deal. Germany was not ready to go to war with Stalin over Romania. King Carol II, the man who had built his entire regime on nationalism in Greater Romania, was forced to cede a massive province to the Soviets without firing a single shot. The humiliation was staggering, but it was just the beginning. Weeks later, in August 1940, Hitler decided to solve Romania's other problems. He summoned Romanian and Hungarian diplomats to Vienna. It was called the Second Vienna Award. It was not a negotiation. It was a dictation. Hitler, as the supreme arbiter of Europe, simply took a pen, drew on a map, and gave 1/3 of Romania's territory, northern Transylvania, to his ally Hungary. This was the end. In the space of a few weeks, King Carol II, the leader, had lost 1/3 of his country without a fight. He had been played and humiliated by both of the dictators he admired. The fury in Romania was not just anger, it was a revolution. The people poured into the streets. They were not yelling about Hitler or Stalin. They were yelling about the man who had failed to protect them. They yelled for King Carol, and they yelled for his Jewish whore, Magda Lupescu, who they blamed for polluting the crown. The Iron Guard, the truly violent, fascist group Carol had tried to control, was now hunting him. The army, humiliated by its order to retreat without a fight, turned its back on him. King Carol II was trapped. He had lost the army, he had lost the people, and he had lost the protection of Germany. He had no allies left except one, a grim, severe general he had just appointed prime minister in a last-ditch effort to placate the military. His name was Marshal Ion Antonescu. Antonescu was not a politician. He was a nationalist zealot, and he viewed Carol as a corrupt cancer who had weakened the nation. On September 5, 1940, Antonescu staged a legal coup. He went to the king and forced him to abdicate his dictatorial powers, suspend the constitution, and grant Antonescu absolute power to rule by decree. Carol, with no options left, agreed. He thought he could survive as a puppet king. He had underestimated Antonescu. The very next day, the marshal returned. He told the king that his presence on the throne was a stain the nation could no longer bear. Antonescu demanded Carol's abdication immediately. And King Carol II, the man who had betrayed his father, his wife, and his country, was finally himself betrayed. Left with no moves, no tricks, he signed the paper, the third and final abdication of his life. The great betrayer had been overthrown. His decade-long chaotic reign was over in total humiliation. He was not allowed an honorable exit. He was forced to flee immediately before the Iron Guard could lynch him. In the pre-dawn hours of September 7th, a special train was prepared. King Carol II, the man on the run, and Magda Lupescu, his mistress, loaded it with everything they could carry, paintings, jewels, cash, and his priceless stamp collection. As their train sped toward the border, Iron Guard legionnaires tried to stop it, firing bullets into the carriages. They barely escaped with their lives. The dictator, who had seen himself as Caesar, had fled his country like a thief in the night, with his mistress and his loot. He would never return. Carol's chaos was over. But he had left a vacuum. Romania, mutilated and humiliated, had no leader. And Marshal Antonescu, now the conducator, needed one thing. He was a dictator, but he needed a cloak of legitimacy. He needed a symbol. He needed a king. And there was one, waiting. On September 6, 1940, the same day his father abdicated, the 18-year-old Grand Voivode Michael was summoned. He was informed that he was once again King Michael I of Romania. You have to imagine the scene. Michael, now 18, was a tall, serious, and profoundly lonely young man. He had spent 10 years being psychologically manipulated by his father. He was shy, soft-spoken, and had been trained to trust no one. And now he was king, but he was a puppet king. He was a prisoner in his own palace. The real power lay with the dictator he had just been forced to appoint, Marshal Antonescu, who was in a full committed alliance with Nazi Germany. Michael, at 18, was the puppet king of a fascist state. He was surrounded by enemies, watched by Antonescu's spies. His tormentor father was gone, but he was completely, utterly alone in that snake pit. He had no friends. He had no allies. He had no one in the world he could trust, except one. And so King Michael I, in his first and only act as an independent monarch, made a demand. It was not a request. It was his own personal ultimatum. He told Antonescu and the entire government, I will do this. I will be your king, but only if you do one thing. I want my mother back. Michael's demand was a political bombshell. It was a direct challenge. Antonescu and his fascist allies did not want Helen. She was a symbol of anti-Carol sentiment, and therefore she had her own independent power base. But Antonescu, a shrewd strategist, recognized he needed the boy king. And to control the boy king, he had to appear magnanimous. Besides, he too despised Carol, and he held a cold, grudging respect for the betrayed wife. He agreed. An official message was dispatched from Bucharest to Florence. At the Villa Sparta, Helen, the exiled ghost, received the news her husband, her nemesis, was overthrown, and her son, the child she was only allowed to see for 8 weeks a year, was now king, and he was calling her home. It was the ultimate vindication. Her patience, her 8 long years of quiet endurance, had been rewarded. In September 1940, Helen boarded a train and returned to Romania. Her arrival was not a political event. It was a spiritual one. When she reached Bucharest, she was met by ecstatic, weeping crowds. The Romanian people, who felt betrayed and humiliated by Carol's cowardice, saw her return as a cleansing. Carol was corruption, lies, and cowardice. Helen was dignity, honor, and maternal sacrifice. She was the good queen who had returned to heal the nation. Antonescu's government, recognizing this wave of emotion, moved quickly. They officially granted her the title Carol had so cruelly stripped away. She was no longer just Her Majesty Helen. A law was passed, bestowing upon her the name Her Majesty, the Queen Mother of Romania, Regina Mama. But the Romania she had returned to was not a place of healing. It was a nightmare. She had, she thought, escaped one prison, the prison of her marriage to Carol. Instead, she had walked into another, larger, and far more dangerous one, the prison of a fascist state. The real power did not lie with her son, the young king. It lay with Marshal Antonescu, who was now in a full, open alliance with Adolf Hitler. Just weeks after Helen's return, German troops were invited into Romania. Bucharest was swarming with Nazi officers. Helen's and Michael's life at the palace, she at Cotrocini, he at the royal palace, became a strange, watched existence. They were national symbols, but they were also prisoners. They were monitored. Their phones were tapped. Their mail was read. Every word, every action was reported back to Antonescu. They had rebuilt their old bond. Once again, it was Helen and Michael against the world. A 19-year-old king and a 44-year-old queen mother trying to maintain a facade of normalcy while the world around them descended into darkness. And in June 1941, that darkness became absolute. Marshal Antonescu, as a loyal ally of Hitler, joined the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union. The war had come, and with the war, an even blacker crime had begun. Almost immediately upon the invasion, the Antonescu regime, already brutally anti-Semitic, began its own solution to the Jewish problem. This is the part of the story that is so often overlooked. The Holocaust in Romania was not something run only by the Germans. It was carried out by Romanians. Under Antonescu's command, with a sickening ferocity, pogroms like the one in Iași erupted. Death trains were set in motion, and the mass deportations of Jews to the concentration camps in Transnistria, a barren no-man's land, began. And this is the moment. This is where Helen, the passive Spartan, the quiet queen, the woman who had been trained her entire life to endure and not interfere, had to make a choice. She could do what she had always done. She could retreat to her garden. She could tend to her son, lock the doors, and endure the storm, telling herself that this was politics, a dirty business she could not control, or she could act. And this is where the hidden story of Queen Helen begins. This is where the woman who had been silent for 2 decades finally at last found her voice, not in a scream but in a whisper of resistance that would save thousands of lives. The Romania that Helen returned to in 1940 was a nation holding its breath, waiting for the other shoe to drop. Marshal Ion Antonescu, the conducator, had established a military dictatorship that was, in all but name, a fascist state, and he had, in his own words, irrevocably tied Romania's fate to that of Adolf Hitler. For Helen, her return to the Cotrocini Palace was not a triumph. It was a re-internment. She and her son, the 19-year-old King Michael, were once again the fortress of two, but this time the walls were not of their own making. They were surrounded by spies, their phones were tapped, and their every move was reported to Antonescu, who was in turn reporting to Berlin. Helen, the woman trained to endure and avoid politics, did what she had always done. She retreated. She created her small, safe world within the palace. She began to organize nursing units for the future war. She tended to her gardens, and she focused, as always, on her son. She tried to make Cotrocini a sanctuary of normalcy, a quiet, civilized island in a sea of rising, jackbooted barbarism. That island was submerged in June 1941. When Hitler invaded the Soviet Union, Antonescu enthusiastically joined him. He did not just send troops, he unleashed a holy war, a crusade to reclaim the lost territories and cleanse the nation. And with this crusade, the mask of civilized dictatorship fell away, revealing the true, monstrous face of the regime. The Holocaust in Romania began, and it was not a slow, bureaucratic process. It was an immediate, frenzied explosion of violence. In the city of Iași, just days into the war, a horrific pogrom was unleashed. Under Antonescu's orders, Romanian soldiers, German units, and even their own neighbors rounded up the city's Jewish population. Thousands were shot in the streets. But the worst was yet to come. Over 10,000 survivors were herded to the train station. They were beaten, robbed, and then forced at gunpoint into sealed cattle cars. The doors were bolted. The cars were shunted onto a siding in the blazing heat of a Romanian summer and simply left. For 7 days, the train sat. There was no food, no water, no air. When the doors were finally opened, nearly all of them had suffocated, died of thirst, or gone mad. This was the Iași death train. This was the regime that Helen's son was the king of, and it was just the beginning. Antonescu's primary solution was deportation. He began to systematically round up the Jewish populations from the new territories of Bessarabia and Bukovina. His plan was to force them into a barren, lawless no-man's land between the Dniester and Bug rivers, a hellish swamp under military control called Transnistria. This was not a resettlement. This was a death march. Tens of thousands, men, women, children, the elderly, were forced to walk hundreds of miles with no food, no shelter, preyed upon by brutal Romanian and German guards. Those who fell were shot. Those who made it to Transnistria were herded into makeshift camps, which were, in reality, just open fields surrounded by barbed wire, where they were left to starve, freeze, or die of typhus. News of this at first was a state secret, but the truth began to leak. It trickled back to Bucharest in hushed whispers, in secret reports, in the terrified pleas of those who were next. And it reached the one man who had the ear of the last sane moral authority in the country, Dr. Alexandru Shafran, the young 31-year-old chief rabbi of Romania. Rabbi Shafran was a man in an impossible position. He was the leader of a community that was being systematically liquidated. He had tried to appeal to the government, to the church, to the patriarch. He was met with silence, with bureaucratic indifference, or with open hostility. He had one last desperate card to play. A person who he knew was also a prisoner, the Queen Mother. He managed, through a loyal courtier, to get a secret audience with Helen at Cotrocini Palace. This was the meeting that changed her. This was the moment the passive Spartan, the Antigone who only endured, was forced to confront a reality that her moral code could not simply endure. Rabbi Shafran did not come with vague rumors. He came with facts. He brought her the lists of the dead from Iași, the deportation orders for Transnistria, the eyewitness accounts of the massacres. He was, in effect, laying the mass murder of his people at the feet of the king's mother. And Helen was shattered. She was at her core a deeply, almost simply, pious Orthodox Christian. She was a mother. What she was hearing was not politics. It was, in her eyes, a mortal sin. It was the mass murder of families. She, the great-granddaughter of Queen Victoria, the sister-in-law of the King of England, was part of a regime that was doing this. She could no longer be the quiet, passive Antigone. She had to act. But how? She had no political power. She had no army. Her every move was watched. A public protest, a grand statement, would be suicidal. It would get her and her son arrested or worse, and it would not save a single life. So she did not become a public warrior. She became a secret one. She activated the only weapon she had, her name, her status, and her one-on-one access to the dictator himself. She and Rabbi Shafran formed a secret two-person resistance, one of the most unlikely alliances of the war. Their system was simple and perilous. Rabbi Shafran, through his network, would gather the intelligence, the specific deportation order for a certain town, the train schedule, the list of orphans about to be sent to Transnistria. He would smuggle this information to Helen. And Helen, the quiet, dignified Queen Mother, would then request an audience with Marshal Antonescu. You have to picture this scene. This small, elegant woman in her simple dark dress, sitting in the office of the most feared man in the country, a man who held the power of life and death over millions. And she would not plead. That was not her way. She would intervene. She used every tool she had. She was not a Romanian. She was a foreign-born queen, and she used that she would appeal to his dignity, his honor as a soldier. She would say, "Marshal, this is not civilized. This is not how we do things. My relatives in Germany do not approve of this barbarism." She would warn him that his legacy and history would be stained. She argued, she reasoned, she pressured, she shamed. And Antonescu, the dictator who could crush any general, was baffled by her. He had a strange, grudging, and deep respect for this woman. He despised Carol, the degenerate king. But Helen was different. She was a true Regina. She had honor, and she was the mother of his king. And so he would listen, and sometimes he would bend. The first interventions were small, a list of 100 prominent Jewish leaders about to be arrested. Helen confronted Antonescu. The order was rescinded. She arranged for her own personal Red Cross trains to be sent, loaded with food, medicine, and clothing, directly into the forbidden zone of Transnistria. Antonescu grudgingly let them pass. She was, in effect, using her royal status as a shield to wage a humanitarian war against her own government. But her greatest and most dangerous battle came in 1942. The Nazi regime, fresh from its Wannsee Conference, was implementing the final solution: They demanded that their ally Romania do its part. The plan was made. The entire remaining Jewish population of Old Romania, starting with Bucharest, was to be rounded up and deported not to Transnistria. This time they were to be sent directly to the Nazi death camps in Poland, to Belzec, to be gassed. The orders were given, the trains were being scheduled. This was the end. Rabbi Shafran, in a state of total desperation, managed to get a final last-ditch message to Helen. He told her what was happening. This was not a local atrocity. This was a direct, systematic pipeline to the gas chambers. Helen, her Spartan reserve now replaced by a cold maternal fury, acted immediately. She did not just request an audience, she demanded one. She went to Antonescu's office, and this time she did not plead, she did not flatter, she threatened. We only have accounts from Rabbi Shafran and other survivors, but the story is one of astonishing, breathtaking courage. She told the dictator that this was not just a crime, it was a mortal sin, an act that would condemn him and the entire nation forever. Antonescu, as always, was stone-faced. He told her it was a state necessity, a German demand. And Helen, the 46-year-old woman who had lost everything, played her one final unblockable card. She told him that if this deportation order was given, she and her son, King Michael, would not remain in the palace. They would walk out of the gates and they would stand in the street with the Jewish families as they were being rounded up. You will not deport them, she is reported to have said, without deporting me and the king with them. We will be at the head of the column. It was the ultimate moral blackmail. It was a checkmate. Antonescu was staggered. He was a dictator, but he was not an idiot. He knew his legitimacy rested on the king. If the king and his mother, the two most revered, sainted symbols in the country, publicly joined the enemies of the state, his government would collapse. The army would never stand for it. Hitler would be furious at the political chaos. He had no choice. He backed down. The order was suspended. The deportation of the Jews of Old Romania to the Nazi death camps was permanently postponed. She had done it. This quiet, passive woman with no army and no political power, armed only with her own conscience and her maternal status, had stood down a fascist dictator and saved, by conservative estimates, over 100,000 lives. Rabbi Shafran, writing after the war, was unequivocal. He said she was the only one who tried. The Queen Mother's interventions were rays of light in the dark. Her courage was absolute. She saved, quite simply, my people. For these acts, decades later, in 1993, Yad Vashem, the World Holocaust Remembrance Center in Israel, would officially name Helen, Queen Mother of Romania, as righteous among the nations. It is Israel's highest civilian honor. She is one of the only queens in history to hold that title. This was her secret war, and it was a war she waged alongside her son, Michael. Now in his early 20s, was her co-conspirator. They would have their quiet dinners in the palace, surrounded by spies, speaking in hushed tones about Antonescu's latest outrage, about Rabbi Shafran's latest desperate report. They were the only two people in the entire country who could trust each other. She was not just saving a people, she was saving her son's soul. She was ensuring that his crown, his legacy, would not be eternally stained by the crimes of the man who truly ruled. But by 1943, their private moral war was overshadowed by a much larger, louder one. At Stalingrad, the German Sixth Army, and with it the entire Romanian Third and Fourth Armies, had been annihilated, wiped from the earth. The tide had not just turned, it was a tidal wave. The Soviet Red Army was now on the offensive, and it was heading west. It was heading for Romania. For 3 years, They had been prisoners of the fascists. Now they were about to be liberated by the communists. They were trapped between two monsters, the retreating, vengeful Nazis and the advancing, brutal Red Army. Antonescu, the dictator, was a fanatic. He was tied to Hitler. He would not surrender. He was prepared to turn all of Romania into a scorched earth battlefield, a final suicidal stand against the Bolshevik horde. Helen, the Antigone, the woman who had watched her father's political games destroy her childhood, now saw it happening again, but on an apocalyptic scale. Her son was the king of a country that was about to be obliterated, sacrificed for the ego of one single man. She and Michael knew they were the only ones who could stop it. The passive Spartan endurance was no longer enough. The quiet moral interventions were no longer enough. The time for whispers was over. The time for a coup d'etat had arrived. By the long, hot summer of 1944, the war in the East was no longer a distant story. It was a roar at Romania's gates. The Soviet Red Army, having shattered the German and Romanian forces at Stalingrad and Kursk, had reconquered Ukraine and was now massing on Romania's border at Iași. The front was collapsing. The end was no longer a question of if, but when. And in Bucharest, Marshal Ion Antonescu, the conductor, was a man in a state of catastrophic ideological denial. He was a soldier, and he had tied his and his nation's honor to Adolf Hitler. He would not break his word. He was prepared to sacrifice every city, every village, every last Romanian soldier in a final suicidal Götterdämmerung against the Bolshevik horde. For Antonescu, surrender was a concept that did not exist. For Queen Helen and King Michael, this was the final existential checkmate. They were trapped. Their secret, moral war to save the Jewish population had been a success, but it was a quiet one. This new threat was total. Antonescu's fanaticism was about to turn their entire country into a scorched earth battlefield. They were the only two people in Romania who possessed the moral and constitutional authority to stop him. Antonescu ruled in the king's name. Therefore, only the king could fire him. And Michael, now 22, was not the shy, stammering boy his father had abused, or the puppet Antonescu thought he was. He had been forged in a crucible. He had been raised by a mother who had taught him one single lesson: duty. He was in his soul his mother's son, a Spartan, and he, unlike his father, would not run. For months, in the deepest secrecy, the 22-year-old king had been doing the one thing Antonescu thought impossible. He had been plotting. He had used his limited supervised audiences to build a shadow coalition. He was secretly meeting with the leaders of the old, historic democratic parties, the Peasant Party and the Liberal Party, men who had been outlawed by the dictatorship. And, even more crucially, he had been building a small loyal cell of officers, high within the army itself, men like General Sănătescu, who were patriots first and fascists second. And who was his co-conspirator? His only true confidant? The one person who knew every detail, every risk, every single night? His mother. You must imagine those nightly conversations at the palace. Helen, now 48, and her son, 22. They would meet for their quiet, formal dinners, surrounded by servants they knew were spies, by guards who listened at the doors. They would speak in French or in English, their private languages, their voices in hushed tones. A mother and son in the heart of a fascist state, allied with Nazi Germany, calmly plotting to overthrow a murderous dictator. This was not a political game for Helen. This was the ultimate terrifying test of her motherhood. She was, in effect, loading a gun and handing it to her only child. She, who had spent her entire life trying to protect him from his father, from the corrupt court, from the war, was now actively encouraging him to commit an act that, if it failed, would not mean exile. It would mean a firing squad in the palace courtyard for both of them. The sheer internal psychological pressure on her must have been unbearable, but she had seen this all before. She had seen her own father in Greece fail to act and lose his kingdom. She would not let her son make the same mistake she had raised him to be the man his father, Carol, never was. And this was the moment of his final exam. The plan they devised was one of astonishing, almost suicidal audacity. It was simple, it was direct, and it relied entirely on Antonescu's one great weakness, his arrogance and his patronizing dismissal of the king. As an irrelevant boy, Michael would summon Marshal Antonescu and his deputy, Mihai Antonescu, to the royal palace for a routine briefing on the collapsing front. He would, in that meeting, personally demand that Antonescu sign an immediate armistice with the Allies and break with Germany. If Antonescu agreed, the king would have saved his country. If he refused, the coup would begin. The day was set, August 23, 1944. The air in the palace that afternoon was so thick with tension, it was almost impossible to breathe. Helen was not in the meeting room. She was in her own quarters, waiting, praying. She was, once again, the Spartan in the garden, waiting for her fate to be decided by a man in a room, but this time the man was her son. At 4 p.m., Marshal Antonescu arrived. He was, as always, arrogant, dismissive, and carrying his leather field marshal's baton. He walked into the king's small yellow study expecting to brief the boy. King Michael was not alone. He was there with General Sănătescu, his new loyal aide. The conversation began. Michael, his voice quiet and calm, asked for the update on the Iași front. Antonescu admitted it was a catastrophe. The line had broken. This was the moment. Michael, his hands reportedly steady, his voice never rising, then said it. He stated that the war was lost, that to continue would be the total destruction of the nation. He demanded that Antonescu immediately contact the Allies and sign an armistice. Antonescu was stunned. He could not believe what he was hearing. He looked at the 22-year-old king as if he were an insect. He was enraged. He snarled at Michael, reportedly calling him a child, a peasant, and a traitor. He refused. Categorically, he said, "I will not be dictated to by a boy. I take my orders from the Führer and from my own conscience. I cannot break my word." Michael looked at the dictator. He had his answer. He said, "Then, Marshal, I am afraid we have no choice." And he gave the quiet, prearranged signal. A side door in the small study opened. 3 of Michael's loyal palace officers, led by a major, stepped out. They were in full uniform. Their pistols were drawn and aimed directly at Antonescu's chest. Antonescu, the great dictator, froze. He was speechless. And Michael, his 22-year-old king, said the words that changed the course of the Second World War. "Marshal, you are under arrest." It was an incredible, surreal moment. The most feared, most powerful man in the country had been arrested by a handful of men in a small office without a single shot fired. The immediate aftermath was pure, desperate farce. They had just arrested a dictator, but in their meticulous planning, they had overlooked one detail: where to put him. They couldn't put him in a guest room. His guards would find him. In a moment of brilliant historical irony, they marched him down the hall to a small, secure walk-in strong room. It was the room his father, King Carol II, had built and used to store his massive, priceless stamp collection. The dictator of Romania was locked in the Playboy's stamp collection safe. The arrest was just Act 1. Now they had to win the country. Antonescu's deputy, Mihai Antonescu, who had been waiting outside, was also arrested. Michael, His hands now trembling with adrenaline ran to his mother. He found her, still praying. "It is done," he said. "It has worked." Helen's terror and pride must have been a wave that almost knocked her over. Her son, her quiet, dutiful boy, was a hero. But the coup wasn't over. It had just begun. Michael raced to the radio station. That night at 10 p.m., the people of Romania gathered around their wireless sets, did not hear the usual military marches. They heard the stammering, serious but clear voice of their young king. "Romanians," his voice crackled, "the dictatorship has ended. All power now returns to the king. A new government of national unity has been formed." And then he dropped the bombshell. He announced that Romania was, effective immediately, switching sides. The war against the Soviet Union, Great Britain, and the United States was over, and Romania was now, as of that moment, in a state of war with Nazi Germany. It was arguably the single most decisive, most dramatic act by any head of state in the entire war. In Berlin, when the news reached him, Adolf Hitler was apoplectic. He reportedly flew into one of his most violent rages, shrieking, pounding his fists. His loyal ally had betrayed him. He shrieked at his generals, "This is treason, treason!" His order was immediate, and it was vengeful. "Find the king, arrest him, and level Bucharest. Level it." The liberation was not a celebration. It was a new, terrifying war. The next morning, the German Luftwaffe, which just 24 hours earlier had been based on Romanian airfields as an ally, now appeared over Bucharest as an enemy. German bombers began to systematically rain bombs down on the capital, specifically targeting the royal palace. Helen and Michael, the heroes of the coup, were not being cheered in the streets. They were hiding in a cellar under the palace, as German bombs, Hitler's personal revenge, blew their home to pieces above their heads. The Fortress of Two was now a literal, physical bunker. For 2 days they endured the bombing, while the new, loyal Romanian army fought a pitched battle in the streets of Bucharest against the occupying German troops. But the act had been decisive. King Michael's coup had done exactly what he intended. It had ripped the entire German front line in the south wide open. It had, in one single stroke, cut off 500,000 German troops. The path to the Balkans, to Hungary, to Austria was now open. It is estimated by historians that the 22-year-old king's brave, desperate gamble single-handedly shortened the war in Europe by 6 months, saving hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of lives. By the end of August, the German bombing had stopped. The battle for Bucharest was won. The Nazi flags were torn down. Helen and Michael emerged from the smoking ruins of their palace victorious. They had survived. They had survived Carol. They had survived Antonescu. They had survived Hitler. They had saved their nation. And now they looked to the east. They looked to the border, where the vanguard of their new ally, their liberator, was crossing the Prut River. The Soviet Red Army had arrived. The fascist prison was gone. The communist one was just being built. King Michael's coup of August 23, 1944, was an act of almost unbelievable courage. It had in one stroke decapitated the fascist regime, and by all historical accounts, shortened the war in Europe by 6 months. As Helen and Michael emerged from the bomb-damaged cellar of their palace, they were, for a brief, shining moment, the undisputed heroes of their nation. The German occupiers had been driven from Bucharest, and the people were celebrating in the streets. They had done it. They had survived Antonescu. They had survived Hitler. And now their new allies, their liberators, were arriving. The first columns of the Soviet Red Army rolled into Bucharest just days later. The atmosphere was at first one of celebration. The Romanians, led by their king, had joined the Allies. But almost immediately, The liberation began to feel chillingly like an occupation. This was not like the arrogant but often correct German military presence. This was a different kind of army. It was an army that had been brutalized by 4 years of the most savage warfare in human history. It was an army that saw Romania not as a new ally, but as a defeated fascist enemy that had conveniently switched sides at the last minute, and they behaved accordingly. For Queen Helen, this new reality was, in its own way, more terrifying than the last. She, who had been trained to value order, dignity, and civilization, now watched as her capital was subjected to a wave of liberators' chaos. There were reports of looting, of random violence, of women being dragged from their homes. The Soviet high command set up in the city's best hotels, and it was immediately clear that they were not there to ally with King Michael's new democratic government. They were there to rule it. Helen and Michael, bound together as always, had just escaped one prison, only to find themselves in another, larger, and far more complex one. This was not a prison of a single raging dictator like Antonescu. This was the prison of a vast, cold, and calculating system. The government Michael had appointed on the night of his coup was a government of national unity. It was made up of the old Democratic Party leaders, the men he had been plotting with, as well as a few token communists included to appease their new Soviet masters. Helen, now 48, resumed her role as the nation's Regina Mama. She immediately threw herself back into what she had done during the last war, mercy. She began once again to organize Red Cross units, to set up hospitals and food kitchens for the starving population, to try and rebuild the nation's shattered social fabric. She was once again the queen of mercy, but the Soviets and their Romanian communist protégés had no interest in mercy. They were interested in power, and this is where the slow-motion strangulation of the monarchy began. It was a classic salami-slicing tactic, and Helen and Michael were forced to watch, helpless, as their country was taken from them, piece by piece. The first slice, the Soviets, through their local proxies, demanded the key ministries of power. They didn't care who was prime minister, as long as they controlled the Ministry of the Interior, the Ministry of Justice, and the Ministry of Information. By the winter of 1944, just months after the coup, the democratic government was a sham. Communist agents were running the police. They were arresting, harassing, and disappearing democratic politicians. The newspapers, now under communist control, began a new, insidious propaganda campaign. They stopped attacking the Germans. They started attacking the monarcho-fascists, the bourgeois elements, and the reactionaries. They were talking about the King Helen, who had seen this all before, the political smears, the character assassinations, knew exactly what was happening. She had seen it done by Venizelos to her father in Greece. She had seen it done by Carol to her. Now she was watching it happen to her son. Michael, trapped, did the only thing he could. He protested. He refused to sign the decrees. He used his constitutional power to block the communist appointments. He was, in effect, a one-man roadblock. The Soviets and their master, Joseph Stalin, were not impressed. They were fresh from Yalta, where they had, in effect, been handed Romania by Roosevelt and Churchill in a backroom deal. The boy king was now just a final bourgeois annoyance to be swept away. In February 1945, the crisis reached its climax. Stalin sent his personal fixer to Bucharest to deal with the problem. This was not a subtle diplomat. This was Andrei Vyshinsky. This was the man who had been the face and voice of Stalin's Great Purge, the prosecutor of the 1930s show trials, a man whose entire career was built on terror, lies, and judicial murder. And he now flew into Bucharest with one single order: destroy the king's government. Wyszynski stormed into the royal palace. He did not come to negotiate with the 23-year-old king. He came to command him. This is one of the great, defining, and humiliating personal stories of Michael's reign. Helen would have been in the next room, or at Kotrosini, waiting by the phone, as her son faced down Stalin's killer. Wyszynski, in his uniform, entered the king's study. He demanded that Michael immediately dismiss his national unity government. Michael, in his quiet, Spartan way, refused. He argued that under the Constitution it was his right. Wyszynski, unused to being told no, exploded. He reportedly began to shriek at the king, pacing the room, his voice rising. "You are not a king," he spat. "You are a czarling." He accused Michael of protecting fascists. And then, in a final act of pure theatrical intimidation, Wyszynski slammed his fist down on the king's desk so hard that it was rumored to have cracked the wood. He bellowed, "The Soviet Union will not be trifled with." He threw a piece of paper on the desk. It was a list of names for a new government. It was a list of pure communist-controlled puppets, headed by a fellow traveler named Petru Groza. Wyszynski gave the king a 2-hour ultimatum: sign it, or he could not guarantee the future existence of the Romanian monarchy. It was a threat, plain and simple. And with that, Wyszynski turned, walked out of the study, and slammed the door so hard that the plaster in the 19th century palace cracked and fell from the ceiling. Michael was left alone in the silence. He was 23 years old. He had faced down Hitler, and now he was being told by Stalin that his time was up. He had no army. The country was occupied by 2 million Soviet soldiers. He had no allies. He called his mother. What could she say? The game was over. They had lost. Michael, his hand forced, signed. He had, in effect, just signed his own abdication warrant, and he knew it. He had just appointed a government that was openly hostile to him, a government whose sole purpose was to destroy him. But this right here is where the controversy of Michael's reign begins. And it is the ultimate expression of his mother's Spartan training. The West, Britain, and the United States were furious. But what could they do? Michael, they felt, had caved. He had not caved. He had just shifted his tactics. He was no longer a player. He was, as his mother had been, a resistor. For the next year, Michael and Helen began what is now known as the Royal Strike. It was an act of pure, passive-aggressive, and profoundly brave defiance. Michael and Helen retreated from Bucharest. They went to the family's summer palace at Sinaia in the mountains, and there they did nothing. The new communist government, led by Groza, would pass laws to seize land, to nationalize industry, to create secret police forces, and they would send these laws to the king to be signed, as the Constitution required. And Michael, with his mother's full stoic support, refused. He would not sign anything. For almost a year, the King of Romania was on strike. He refused to meet with his government. He refused to speak to his prime minister. He refused to sign a single piece of paper. He had, in effect, shut down the monarchy. He was a constitutional black hole. This drove the communists and Stalin insane. They had the power, but they did not have the legitimacy. They were ruling in the name of a king who was every single day publicly demonstrating that he did not approve. It was a brilliant final act of Spartan defiance. He was proving to the world that he was a prisoner, but the world was not listening. This is the final bitter betrayal Michael and Helen had been resisting, first the Nazis and now the communists, in the desperate, naive belief that their allies in the West, Britain and America, would eventually come to their aid. They believed that their hero's coup of 1944 had earned them a seat at the table. They had misunderstood the new cold-blooded world of Yalta and Potsdam. The West was not coming. In the great cynical carve-up of post-war Europe, Romania had been traded. It was in Stalin's sphere of influence, and a striking king was just inconvenient. In late 1945, Britain and the United States, in a final pragmatic and soul-crushing move, officially recognized Petru Groza's communist government. They had in effect just thrown Michael and Helen to the wolves. The royal strike had failed. The West had abandoned them. They were now completely and totally on their own. With the West's approval, the communists now had the legitimacy they craved. They no longer needed to pretend. They immediately scheduled a general election for November 1946. It was a total, terrifying fraud. The Democratic Party leaders, the ones who had plotted with Michael in 1944, were arrested. Their newspapers were shut down. Their supporters were beaten in the streets by communist thugs. The election itself was a farce. The votes were, by all accounts, overwhelmingly in favor of the king's Democratic parties. But the official results announced by the communist government told a different story. The communists had won a landslide victory. With over 90% of the vote, it was over. The last vestige of democracy was dead. Romania was now, officially, a people's republic in all but name. And the first act of this new legitimate government was to mop up the past Iuliu Maniu, the aged, respected leader of the Peasant Party. The man who had been Michael's key co-conspirator was arrested. He was put on a Stalinist show trial, exactly like the ones Wyszynski had perfected. He was accused of being a fascist, a traitor, and a spy for the West. King Michael, in a final desperate act, tried to intervene, tried to save the man who had saved him. The government laughed in his face. Maniu was found guilty, and he was sentenced to life in a hard labor prison, where he would, in 1953, die, his body thrown into an unmarked grave. This was the new reality. This was the world Helen and Michael now inhabited. It was a world of terror, of show trials, and of disappearing friends. They were no longer resistors. They were not even prisoners. They were hostages. They were the last glittering prize, the final bourgeois symbol that the communists had not yet figured out how to destroy without starting a civil war. So they sat in their palaces under 24-hour surveillance for another long, terrifying year. Fine. They were the living dead. Then, in the autumn of 1947, a strange, unexpected, and final burst of light. An invitation arrived. From London, it was from their cousin Lilibet. Princess Elizabeth, the future Queen of England, was getting married to their other cousin, Prince Philip of Greece, and Denmark King Michael, and Queen Mother Helen were formally invited to the wedding. The communists were trapped. They could not forbid the king from attending the wedding of his own cousin. It would be an international scandal. Grudgingly, and with a small army of aides to watch them, they gave their permission. In November 1947, Helen and Michael boarded a plane and flew out of the dark, cold, terrifying prison of Bucharest and into the bright, free, celebratory world of London. It must have been like stepping onto another planet. They were, for the first time in 7 years, free. They were celebrated. They were toasted. King Michael, in his dashing uniform, was the hero. Queen Helen was the brave, dignified Queen Mother. They were the toast of the wedding. And at one of the pre-wedding balls, King Michael, the shy 26-year-old monarch, was introduced to a young, dark-haired and beautiful princess, Anne of Bourbon-Parma. It was, just like it had been for his mother, a coup de foudre. He fell, instantly and completely, in love. For 3 weeks, Helen watched as her son, for the first time in his entire tragic life, was happy. He was in love. He was free. He was celebrated. This was their chance, their escape. They were out. The British government and Winston Churchill himself met with Michael. They begged him not to go back. They told him it's a trap. Stay here. Announce a government in exile. They will never let you out again. Helen, the professional exile, the Spartan, knew they were right. She had survived 3 exiles. She knew how to do this. This was the logical, sensible, safe thing to do. But her son was not like his father, Carol. He was not like his grandfather, Constantine. He was not a man who ran. He was the man she had raised him to be, a man of duty. Michael's response to Churchill was quiet, and it was absolute. "I am the king," he said. "A king cannot be in exile. My people are there. I cannot and will not abandon them." He had made his decision. He was going back. And Helen, the Antigone who had followed her own father into exile, made her own final fateful choice. If her son was going back into the prison, he would not go back alone. In late December 1947, just before Christmas, Helen and Michael said goodbye to the free world. They said goodbye to their new love, Princess Anne. They boarded a train and they traveled in silence back across the new Iron Curtain, back to Bucharest. They knew exactly what they were returning to. The air in the capital was colder, darker, and more silent than before. The palace felt not like a home, but like a morgue. They were no longer hostages. They were, they knew, lambs, walking calmly and with their eyes wide open to the slaughter. The London wedding of November 1947 had been a dream of freedom. But when Helen and King Michael chose duty and returned to Bucharest, they knew they were walking back into a prison. The communist government, furious at their popularity in the West, was waiting. The end came on December 30th. Prime Minister Petru Groza summoned the king for an audience. Michael, knowing this was it, asked his mother to be with him. It was not a meeting, it was an ambush. The palace was surrounded by communist troops, the phone lines cut. Groza and the party chief, Gheorghiu Dej, entered and laid a pre-typed abdication paper on the desk. Michael, in a last act of legalistic defiance, refused. The mood snapped. Groza gestured to the soldiers, and then, the final brutal checkmate, a revolver was placed on the desk. He told the king to sign, or 1,000 royalist students arrested that morning would be executed by nightfall. It was the ultimate diabolical choice, his crown or a bloodbath. Michael looked at his mother. Helen, the Queen of Mercy, who had spent her life saving lives, knew they could not be the cause of a massacre. In that small silent room, she gave a single imperceptible nod. It was over. Michael signed. They were given 2 hours to pack 1 suitcase each, then marched at gunpoint to a sealed train. In a final vicious humiliation, soldiers patted down the 51-year-old Queen Mother for hidden jewels. The door was locked from the outside. Helen was in exile for the 3rd and final time. She would never see her country again. The rest of Helen's life was a long, quiet, and melancholy coda, the ultimate, final expression of her Spartan character. She was now a penniless, stateless refugee. She returned to her one true sanctuary, the Villa Sparta in Florence. For the next 3 decades, she lived the life of a noble ghost. She tended her garden, she read her books, and, in her final act of defiance, she never spoke of it. No bitter memoir, no hateful interview. Her silence was her final, unbreakable armor. She outlived her betrayer, Carol II, who died pathetically in 1953. She, in contrast, endured. When she died quietly in Lausanne in 1982, the world barely noticed. She was a forgotten relic, a footnote buried in a foreign land. It was a sad, quiet, and seemingly final end, but that is not where her story ends. History, which had defined her life, had one last magnificent turn to make. 7 years after her death, the 1989 revolution destroyed the communist regime that had exiled her. A new Romania, emerging from the darkness, began to search for its stolen past. They remembered their hero king, and they remembered the mother who had been their conscience. In 2019, a Romanian military plane flew to Switzerland. They did not come for a refugee. They came for a queen. Helen's casket was brought back to Bucharest and laid in state at Cotroceni Palace, the very home from which she had been banished. The circle was now complete. After 71 years in the wilderness, the Queen of Mercy had finally, at last, come home. So in the end, what is the legacy of Queen Helen? Her legacy is a quiet lesson. She was a 19th century woman forged by Spartan virtues, duty, faith, and a rigid moral code. And she was forced to face the worst nightmares of the 20th century: personal betrayal, brutal fascism, and totalitarian communism. She lost everything. She lost her first homeland. She lost her husband to a public humiliation. She lost her crown. And finally, she lost her country. But she never, ever lost herself. That passive princess, that quiet queen, was, in her own way, one of the bravest women of her era. She did not just endure the betrayal of a husband. She alone raised a son to become a hero. And in her greatest, most secret act, she stood up to a fascist dictator and saved thousands of lives. Not with an army, not with a speech, but with the absolute, unshakable force of her moral conscience. Her life was not a fairy tale. It was a testament that true strength is not about power, but about endurance. And that dignity, true dignity, is not something given to you by a crown. It is something that no king, no dictator, and no commissar can ever truly take away.